Welcome, everyone. We are gonna get going. I'm Kait Boyle. I'll introduce myself a bit more in a moment. And I'm here to kick off this first new webinar series, the Waypoints webinars, which are kind of dovetailing off of the success of our Bikepacker's Guide webinars, which just wrapped up. There are now officially, I think, 11 webinars out there on YouTube that you can see that are all educational based. And this webinar series is new and is going to be highlighting different bikepacking routes that are out there published in the world to both share inspiration and stories, and also information to help you plan and get out on a trip on those routes. Bikepacking Roots is a 501c3 nonprofit. We were founded in 2017. Kurt and I, Kurt is the other co-presenter here, we're the co-founders, and we're now really excited to be a successful nonprofit with an official, full-time, very kick-ass executive director, Noelle Battle, and some other part-time staff, as well as a wonderful board of directors. And I did see one of our founding board members is also here participating, so hey. It's pretty cool to see how much Bikepacking Roots has grown in the last, I guess, 8 years now. And ultimately, community building, community bikepacking education, accessible route development, and bikepacking advocacy are what we focus on. And this webinar is a really cool example of how we tie a lot of those into one big effort of education, route development, and advocacy. Kurt and I founded Bikepacking Roots. Beyond that, we're both longtime bikepackers. I believe Kurt started bikepacking in about 2008 or 2009. I started bikepacking in 2011. And for both of us, that has led us to an opportunity to make a career centered around riding bikes and bikepacking and trying to lower the barriers to the sport and share our experience with others. And that has come through Bikepacking Roots and being professional athletes. But we both have a background in teaching at Prescott College, which is how we met. And it was while teaching geology through bikepacking that we developed a working relationship that led to the founding of Bikepacking Roots, really wanting to bring intentional advocacy and education to the bikepacking space. I taught adventure education and Kurt taught geology. So there's a good blend in our story with this route in particular. So tonight we are going to be talking about bear's ears. And I am going to, hopefully not too clunkily, switch my screen to view a different slide. There we go. Okay, that wasn't too clunky as far as Zoom goes. So we're going to talk about one of our routes, and this is, again, our first waypoints presentation. You can see on the Bikepacking Roots website here that the blue lines are routes that we either have published or are working on. And then the red routes are a number of other bikepacking routes out there that are popular and published in a variety of different places. But you can see the blue network is quite large. And when we zoom in here, I'm gonna take you into the Bears Ears loops. So we're zooming in on Utah. This is also going to be a kind of neat showcase of our map interface and the platform on the website. This was updated maybe a year and a half ago. And this long line that went from Canada down through Idaho, Utah, and Arizona is the Western Wildlands route, which we developed prior to the Bears Ears loops. And the Bears Ears loops are this kind of 8-shape network coming to the east off of the Western Wildland route. And as we zoom in, you can see that this route network is quite large and spans north of I-70 through Castle Valley, down right in between arches and canyonlands, over some mountains, through one of the most remote parts of the West, in my opinion. Over the Henry Mountains, there's an option to go to the north through the San Rafael Desert, or to continue even further west and even into higher and equally remote terrain. And with this, the Bears Ears loops could be 3 different loops, and we'll talk more about those in detail. But I just wanted to center this route in its space in the continental US. Now I'm going to move back over. And in a moment, we're going to talk about exactly what we will talk about tonight. View slideshow. There we go. Okay. So a quick visual intro. That was a map. That's just 2D, trying to take a beautiful landscape and show you what it looks like. But here are the Bears Ears. And one of the reasons that Kurt and I were inspired to create a route network and not just one route in the area is because this landscape is so incredibly diverse and so big. And so there are mountains and high elevation, some often snow covered and green with water landscapes, all the way down to the deserts that are very characteristic of like Canyonlands National Park and the Colorado Plateau. And with that, the riding is incredibly diverse as well. So from arid to high elevation and lush, it is a quite diverse area. Kurt's going to talk for a moment about the vision and inspiration behind the route, and then we'll go on a deep dive into the Bears Ears.
Yeah. Can you hear me? This
Mhm.
all good? All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks all for being here. I'm excited to share more about one of my favorite places in the entire world with all of you, and that was part of what led to the formation of these routes. But this area was one that I was kind of exploring on my own and getting to know almost 15 years ago. And I'd spent one summer, about a month-long solo bikepacking trip, literally just meandering through Utah. And it was before any bikepacking routes had been established in the state, pretty much, aside from a few by Dave Harris. And it was a really inspirational trip for me that I literally just carried a stack of maps along the way and figured out where I was going and ended up in the region that these loops sit now and was just completely awestruck. And it was an area I'd spent time before, but never moving through at the speed of a bicycle and never exploring in that way. And it was a really, I think, for me and my evolution as a cyclist and a lover of landscapes in the West, it was a really pivotal experience for me. And I didn't expect at the time that it was something I was going to want to spend a lot of effort creating something to help more people experience that just because I was kind of a little intimidated by how remote it was, how few people there were out there, how few, little water there is, a lot of the characteristic remote desert landscape types of things. And then a few years later, and we'll go into a lot more detail with all of this, but the whole region was, or not the whole region, but a chunk of this region was set aside for protection as a national monument and ended up being the center of a huge battle for the kind of around the future of preservation of public lands in the West. And so that inspired us to then put a lot of energy into the creation of these routes to help more people see this landscape, experience it firsthand. And as a large part of what Kait's master's work was how do you educate people and get them into landscapes to help them become advocates for the protection of those places. And so this and all the time that we spent teaching out there with students, whether I was teaching geology or she was teaching adventure education courses, that really just cemented how important these places are and how much we wanted to try to do something to help protect them. And so we had that opportunity through bikepacking routes, and it was just a completely natural fit to create a series of loops that branch off the Western Wildlands route, because that was one that we had already created and released, and create more opportunities for people to spend time in those areas, whether it's as part of a literally across the country adventure or as a 3 or 4 or 5 day trip on one of the smaller pieces of the Bears Ears loops. So, as Kait shared earlier on one map, here's a couple different maps that show the two different loops. The Bears Ears loop is the eastern of the two, the Swell loop is the western of the two, and the middle of those two are a kind of a shortcut across that center part if you want to only do part of the whole thing. And so we'll talk a lot more about these different routes, kind of segment by segment, a little bit later in the presentation.
Great. So for the rest of our time here in the next hour and 15 minutes or so, including questions, we're going to talk a bit about the landscape, like why Bears Ears beyond our own personal connection to the landscape. But a bit more about the story that really has added a lot of context to what makes the landscape and experience of traveling through it so special. We're going to go through the loop network in more detail to share just more about how you can, what would lead you to choose one route loop over the other, what it looks like segment to segment, how those are broken up, and a bit of a map study. And then we'll close with some of the logistics and planning considerations for this with Bikepacking Roots resources for this route. One thing that I do want to note to preface all of this is that one of our resources is a physical guide that we wrote back when we published this route. So there's the online resource of the route and the GPX files you can get for it. And then there's also a print and a PDF or digital guide to the whole route. And it is many, many pages long, and we'll have entire chapters on all of the sections here that we're going to talk in more conciseness tonight about. So if you want to learn more about like the physical landscape, the geography and the geology, or the cultural history, or the story of public lands and land management in Bears Ears, or more about like the season and the bike setup and like food and water resupply, that is all like very deeply explained in the guide. So I'm just gonna plug that as you want. If you find yourself wanting to know more, there's a lot more out there. And we will take questions after the second section with Loops Network and then also at the end. So why Bears Ears? The eternal question for this route. Um, the main thing, so the thing that I want to share about Bears Ears is that the Bears Ears themselves are two significant, they're two adjacent buttes that are out in southeastern Utah that together resemble a pair of Bears Ears. And they rise from a high plateau in southeastern Utah that from a number of different very far away vantages, you can see them for hundreds and hundreds of miles, which is significant when you look at these two little buttes because they're not that tall, but just how they're positioned on a plateau and aren't obstructed by any other higher topography. You can see them from farther away than a lot of other larger geographic features. And so in that way, they're a way of grounding yourself in a landscape and knowing where you are. And they have been that for people for far longer than white people have been riding bicycles or recreating on a landscape. And so in that way, the Bears Ears position themselves in the landscape as a significant geographic feature. And as such, because of their significance through human time, they've developed significant historical and political significance, which we'll talk a bit more about. To start, on December 28th in 2016, President Obama signed a proclamation that designated Bears Ears National Monument under executive order, which was granted by the power of the Antiquities Act. And Kurt's going to explain a bit more about this. But this was a new 1.35 million acre monument protected one of the most significant cultural areas in the United States, home to over 100,000 cultural and archaeological sites, and sacred to many indigenous groups. Um, and not only did the designation of Bears Ears promise to protect the cultural and archaeological resources, but it marked it the first time ever, like in 2016, this was the first time this ever happened, that a national monument was created in response to the voices and advocacy of indigenous groups who call the landscape home, which was comprised of leaders from the Hopi tribe, the Navajo Nation, the Ute Mountain Ute, the Pueblo of Zuni, and the Ute Indian tribe, who collectively formed the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. Um, Coincidentally, like the Bears Ears Loops network was published just a couple years later, and so that time frame of 2016 was like a very significant political moment for the protection of landscapes and the opportunity for us as bikepacking routes to highlight that. The guidebook explores the significance and role of Bears Ears landscape through several lenses: indigenous, conservation focused, resource oriented, recreational, and socio-political. And it also delves more into the human timeframe of this as well. Um, want to move slides. So from a physical landscape perspective, like I like to think of landscape as being a number of different layers, like the physical landscape, the living landscape, the biological landscape, the human landscape, all the different layers of that. But when we think about just the physical landscape, um, Bears Ears and the broader landscape surrounding the buttes themselves are situated in the heart of the Colorado Plateau, which is one of my favorite geographic landscapes in the world, honestly. Um, the Colorado Plateau is a 130,000-mile uplifted landmass. If you were to picture, and I think we have a map coming, but if you were to picture the four corner states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, the Colorado Plateau encompasses that Four Corners region, extending all the way down to central Arizona, where the Mogollon Highlands are, all the way east into like the San Juan, the Southern Rocky Mountains, north up to that like I-70 area, like in Fruita zone, if you ever ride there, and in the Book Cliffs, and then west down through Utah, just east of I-70 or I-15. I-15. Thanks. Roughly. Kurt's an expert on this too. And generally, the Colorado Plateau is characterized by broad, sinuous canyons, and uh, which are deeply carved into this all these uplifted plateaus of sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is a huge characteristic of the Colorado Plateau. And then the plateau itself is dotted by ancient mountains cored by magma that pushed its way up from deep below. So if you've ever been to Moab and seen the La Salles, those are probably the most iconic of those mountains. But there are a number of those, and they're shown in these pictures here.
Yeah, so from a physical standpoint, it's an incredibly diverse landscape, and I think that's one of the attractions to it. For so many people. There's also the cultural element of the landscape, and this is one that you can look at through the modern lens or through a much longer term lens. And so if we think about the longer term history of humans in this landscape, it goes back, I mean, based on archaeological evidence, over 10,000 years. And if you look at the origin stories and the histories of the indigenous groups that call this place home, that time frame gets pushed back even farther. So people have been living in this place for thousands and thousands of years, and long before it was settled by Europeans, obviously. A lot of folks are very familiar with the iconic petroglyphs that are found all throughout Canyon Country. Most of these date back to ancestral Puebloan time, which was between 800 and 1300 AD, and that was when there were folks that are not directly related to any of the modern indigenous groups that were occupying this landscape. And they still fairly mysteriously, it's not agreed upon exactly why they disappeared, but likely related to changes in climate at that time around 1300. But then there were other groups that arrived from elsewhere. The Ute and Paiute cultures came into the region. The Dene, the Navajo came in around 1300, and others. And all of those groups are still present in the region today, although they've been considerably displaced by everything that happened in the subsequent centuries. Spanish influence finally made its way into this region by the 1500s, and by the 1800s, trappers started to infiltrate farther and farther into the region. And by the kind of mid 1500s, Mormon settlers were the main new group of people entering this region. And it wasn't until like the 1870s, 1880s that there started to be any scientific investigation or significant mapping of this region and investigation of resources that maybe could be extracted from the area. And there were U.S. Geologic Survey efforts at that time. That was the same era when the Powell expeditions went down the Green and Colorado rivers and explored that area. And it was, I think, right around 1900 that the Henry Mountains that Kate mentioned earlier, that one of these loops goes right over, those were not named until right around 1900. They were the last mapped and last mountain range in the West to be named by white folks. And so that kind of highlights just how remote this region is. In the 1860s, all the way until the early 1900s, was when the US Army really made huge efforts to remove the tribes that were living in this area. And most of them were either physically moved out of the region, forced out of the region onto reservations elsewhere, like the Navajo, who then were able to actually come back and I shouldn't say they were able to, they were permitted to. Um, and so these tribes are all still present in the region on reservation lands. Some of them have much more significant size reservations than others. The Paiute, Southern Paiute, basically lost all of their territory and have just a few tiny reservations left. Navajo have a much more significant one just south of the Bears Ears National Monument area. And all of those tribes are the ones that were involved in the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. And so those folks basically recognize that the core of this region, the Bears Ears region, is still relatively intact in the grand scheme of things. It was mostly public lands. I mean, basically everything that was designated as Bears Ears National Monument was already managed by the Forest Service or the BLM. And that was why they wanted to see this region protected and why the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition formed and made those huge efforts that the Obama administration listened to and heard and created the monument in response to that and invited the tribal coalition groups to actually help with the management planning for just what was the future of that, the monument going to be. So that kind of brings us right to the public lands, the threats, and the status. And yes, this one here. Uh, so I think it's important to note at this point that this map here shows all the public lands in the U.S., federally managed public lands, I should say. The green are all managed by the Forest Service. The orange or yellowy orange color are all managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And then there's little other bits in here, the blues, which there are a bit of in southern Utah there. Those are managed by the National Park Service. And obviously, the Western US has far more public lands than any other part of the country does. Utah and Nevada lead with the largest percentage of the state's land area as being public lands. And that area in southeastern Utah is one of the most kind of continuous, unbroken areas of public lands in the entire western contiguous US. So if you look at Utah also, you'll notice there's a lot of national parks, a lot of national monuments in there, including Grand Staircase, Escalante National Monument, just a little bit to the south. That's one of the largest national monuments in the West. And if we're talking about monuments, we should actually define what they are because there's a very specific um, history or story to them that should be distinguished that makes them different from national parks and other types of public lands. And so, as Kate mentioned earlier, Bears Ears was the national monument was designated by the Obama administration under the power of the Antiquities Act of 1906. And that's how all national monuments have been formed, is based on that Antiquities Act. And what that act says is that lands can be set aside for preservation if they meet certain standards for preserving archaeological, cultural, historic, or scientific resources. And so if you look around the country, some national monuments are historic sites like battlefields or buildings. Others are very different, and they're large swaths of landscape like Bears Ears or Grand Staircase are. And so national parks can preserve similar things, but national parks are designated through acts of Congress, whereas national monuments are executive action by the president. So different ways that they're formed, and Congress can later redesignate monuments as parks, which has been done before. So some national monuments have kind of evolved into national parks. Um, and the Park Service manages pretty much all national parks and most national monuments. But there are some of these larger, newer national monuments in the Western US that are managed by other land management agencies, like the Forest Service, like the BLM. Some are Fish and Wildlife Service, and some are a combination of all of those. And so Bears Ears National Monument was already existing BLM and Forest Service lands. And so the whole vision behind the monument management was that it would be jointly managed by the Forest Service, by the BLM, and with significant input from the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. That coalition that Kait mentioned earlier, the Intertribal Coalition, that formed basically in earnest in 2015, and it only took a couple years of advocacy and public support for the Obama administration to recognize that this monument was one that should be created. And that was, I think, that designation happened in 2016. So it was a pretty fast process. There was in Utah a lot of opposition to it because local folks saw it as a land grab, which wasn't actually true because it already was all public lands. So no private lands were incorporated into the monument. And the management of the monument has continued to allow almost all existing motorized access and grazing leases and everything like that to continue. The biggest impact it's had has been on increased protections for cultural sites and increased protections against mineral, whether it's oil and gas or other mineral extraction in the region, and coming up with a bit more stringent management plan to protect the area in the future. More firmly than typical BLM lands or Forest Service lands are managed. So there was that opposition initially for it. There gradually was a little bit more acceptance of it when folks that were local to it recognized that not actually all that much on the ground had changed. And despite that, when the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, took office, right from the outset, it was clear that Bears Ears National Monument and Grand Staircase National Monument, just to the south, were in the crosshairs of their efforts to reduce government overreach in the West. And basically, that administration wanted to completely undo the monument uh, creation for both Bears Ears and Grand Staircase. And so this map that's up right now, this is one from Grand Canyon Trust, and on the lower right, that big kind of light gray and green uh, bounded area. I don't know. Yeah, Kait, can you trace the outline of all of that and all the way up to the north? Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. All the way up there. Yeah, all that. So that was the um, original boundaries of the national monument. And then if you look over to the left, there's those three smaller ones right there. The leftmost of those was the boundaries that the Intertribal Coalition had asked for the monument. And if you compare that to the bigger block to the right, that Kait outlined first, there's a large strip that wasn't included in there that had a lot of uranium mine claims in it. Nope, sorry, Kait, down and left. Yep, that white area right through there. So that one right there shows what the actual monument designation looked like. And then the Trump administration did successfully, despite a lot of legal efforts to block it and a lot of public opposition to it, reduce the size of the monument to that right of those three, which basically was two units right there, a northern one and a southern one. And the Bears Ears National Monument name, Bears Ears, was very intentionally created to be the English name for it, Bears Ears. And that was what the Intertribal Coalition tribes decided should be, that they didn't want any one of their language names for the buttes to be the name for the monument because they didn't want to elevate any one of their tribes above the other in that. So they chose Bears Ears as the name for the monument. Trump ended up renaming, I forget the name of the northern one. The southern one was the Shashja unit, and they intentionally chose names from the Dene language for those as an affront to the neutrality choice that the Intertribal Coalition had initially went with. But the areas that were removed from the monument in that the shrinking that the Trump administration did, where if you go down to that map of Utah in the lower left, it's kind of hard to see, but there's so that blue band all the way through there, that's the Colorado River, managed by the National Park Service. That's the blue. And then the monument itself was mostly on the east side of that. And all those red areas in there, hopefully no one here is red green colorblind because this is a terrible image for those folks, unfortunately. But those red areas are all high grade uranium ore deposits. And this was an area that during and after World War II and during the Cold War, especially, there was extensive uranium mining. It was really devastating on the landscape in multiple ways, and there's still enormous contamination issues there and to the south on Navajo Nation. But those areas specifically were removed from the monument protections, and there's a lot of lobbying for that behind closed door meetings from the Energy Fuels Limited company, which owns the only uranium processing mill in the country, which is in the town of Blanding, just outside of Bears Ears National Monument. So there were a lot of concerns, especially coming from Navajo Nation, about the future of uranium mining in the region because of how devastated they were on it. And then obviously also just what are the impacts of potential widespread surface mining going to be on this landscape. So that was the Trump administration. When Biden administration took office, they very quickly restored the original boundaries to the monument. So it went back to that lower right large map boundary there. And the BLM and Forest Service, along with the Intertribal Coalition, started working on a new management plan. I think it was the third management plan that they've had gone through that process in a few years. And so Bikepacking Roots was involved in providing suggestions for management as it relates to bikepackers and conservation specifically in that. And the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition was given a larger, more substantial role in helping decide the future of management and co-managing it at that time. So things were looking pretty good at that point. And now, as the Trump administration has retaken office, um, they almost immediately ordered a very, very abrupt review of all national monuments in the country and specifically looking at the mineral or extractive potentials of those monuments. And Trump also voiced that they're planning on putting an end to the Antiquities Act so future presidents cannot create national monuments using that executive action. There also have been a number of recent bills in the Utah legislature just in the past, I think, 6, 8 months that were attempting to force federal lands to be transferred to state control. And there was considerable public outcry in the state of Utah and nationally, but especially within the state of Utah. And impressively, those did not make it through the state legislature despite the composition of the legislature at that time. So it is clear that public lands are important to people in Utah and everywhere. There also was a recent survey of Utah residents about their perceptions of the importance of Bears Ears and Great Staircase Escalante National Monument. I think the results were like something like 87 and 89% were in support of maintaining the monuments as is. So there is large support for them, and we just need to do everything we can in the coming years to continue to advocate for these areas to continue to be preserved in the way that they are right now. So that's a quick summary, as quick as we can do on the history there. As Kate mentioned, there's more in the guidebook on the history of public lands and the history of Bears Ears National Monument specifically, if you want to know more.
Kurt, I wouldn't say I touched on the geology or geography of the Colorado Plateau too much. Is there anything you want to add
True.
to
Yes,
I
sorry, I skipped
even
over that. that slide, you gave a little prelude to it with the landscape, and I don't want to. I can't actually, being a geologist and having taught all about the Colorado Plateau and on it with students. These are actually two former students in this picture right here. Um, I can't summarize the geology in 30 seconds or a minute other than saying it's incredibly diverse and incredibly stunning and unlike any geology anywhere else in the world. And there's a reason that basically every college that has a solid geology program with some funding sends students on field trips to this region to study it and experience it. And it's one of the reasons that we took the geology through bikepacking course up here every time we taught it, is because one of the best ways to see it and understand it is to travel through it on bike. And this photo right here was taken up high in the Abajo Mountains. The Bears Ears Loops, the road that it takes is just, I think, half a mile to behind where I was standing when I took this photo. And if you did want to take single track for one section, you can follow the trail that these two riders are on. And it goes from these high mountains at, it's like subalpine, basically 8,000 feet, something like that, all the way down to Newspaper Rock in Canyonlands National Park, out in that canyon country down below. And I mean, vertically, it's a remarkable journey to move through all of that. And then if you ride across the landscape for tens or hundreds of miles, the diversity of what you see and how it unfolds before you is just remarkable. So there's an entire chapter in the guidebook on the geology of the region and with stratigraphic columns that help you identify just exactly where you are and what the story of those rocks is in that area. So I think I mean, another thing about national parks and so many of them in the West as to why they exist is because of the unique geology in the area. And there's a reason that there's so many national parks like Arches and Canyonlands and Capitol Reef in this area, is because it's absolutely one of a kind, world class landscape beauty. And that's all related to the geology. How's that, Kate?
That's good. And the only thing I'd chime in on with what's shown so well here and experienced so incredibly in riding from the Abajos all the way down into Canyonlands or from the La Salles or the Henry Mountains all the way down into Canyonlands in the Colorado River elevation is just with that incredibly huge elevation difference from the Colorado River all the way up to these alpine areas on these peaks at 10, 11, 12,000 feet. It comes with that incredible ecological diversity. And in this picture, like you can see what would be kind of like subalpine meadows and wildflowers. There's some spruce fir forests in here, like conifers that do not grow in the desert. And then one can look out into this landscape here where there's like scrub oak, and there's some pinyon juniper. And then as you get lower down, there would be the ecological communities that can survive an incredibly hot and dry, kind of like poor soil quality um, areas. And so that as you would ride the Bears Ears Loop, one of the things that make climbing high up into mountains and descending really low into deserts really rewarding and cool is also seeing the ecological communities change with the elevation and aspect, and with that available water changes as well. And kind of as a bike packer who needs water, you get to relate to what it would be like to live and survive in that landscape. And so with that, let's move into the routes themselves. This is a kind of looping back to that initial introduction of the routes. We have the Bears Ears loops are 3 loops. The one big perimeter loop is the plateau loop. Kurt and I were just reminiscing as we were preparing for this webinar how hard it was to name these. um, but the plateau loop would be combining the 2 loops and not taking that cut through the middle. I'm sure if you were actually like wanted to ride it all, you could figure out how to make a figure 8 out of this, and you'd have to ride some sections twice. If you do that, you get to name it. The swell loop is the western half of the plateau loop with this segment 2A. That's named after the San Rafael swell. And it shares a leg with the Western Wildlands route, which is a 2,700-mile route of dirt riding from Canada to Mexico or vice versa through Idaho, Utah, and Arizona. Um, Interestingly, despite there being sections in these other loops that do go up and over higher peaks like the La Salles, the Abajos, and the Henry Mountains. It's actually this western leg of the Western Wildland Route on the swell loop that would stay high for the longest. This part, although not going over any of those kind of iconic laccoliths, that it does traverse a series of high plateaus that where you will often be riding at 10,000 feet continuously for a while. It's not just up and then down. And so with that, that would also be the segment that holds snow for the longest, would have the coldest temperatures, etc. And then our loop over to the east is the Bears Ears loop. We did want to name one of the loops after the Bears Ears, and that is the loop that goes right by the Bears Ears, the two little iconic buttes that you can see from very far away. It also This loop is probably the more populated one in that it does go right through Green River, which is on I-70. It crosses under I-70. It goes right through like into the town of Moab. Um, and then from there, it does get into more remote territory. In general, these loops, regardless of which one you take, will go over high mountains and will traverse long stretches of very dry, very rocky, very arid landscape. We made these to be entirely on um, a road surface of type with as little pavement as possible. So the goal was to have as little pavement as possible, but there is not any single track in the route, though they were designed with mountain bikes in mind because these are not like gravel roads. There's some graded gravel roads, but generally the route design was seeking out the lesser traveled two tracks, kind of rocky 4x4 roads, partly for the riding experience and also partly for where those roads take you and how kind of quiet and wild they can feel. And so while there isn't single track per se, I would personally classify much of these loops to be like as remote as um, riding like or more remote really than riding the Colorado Trail, but as remote as many sections of like the Arizona Trail or some of the more iconic like rugged single track routes. But the riding wouldn't be as technical. Is there anything else I want to say about these loops right now? I think so. So we're going to talk more about bike setup, but before that, Kurt's going to dive more into the loops themselves and what they look like by the numbers and pictures.
Yeah, so we'll do a quick tour of these loops and just show you all a little bit more about what to expect for them and what each one is like because the plateau loop and or sorry the Bears Ears loop and the swell loop are very different experiences because of the differences in landscape between those two. And the plateau loop is a pretty huge tour to Colorado Plateau if you want to take something like that on. So the plateau loop itself is about 650 miles, and we have a rating scale for routes that we use at Bikepacking Routes that breaks things apart into the physical difficulty and the technical difficulty because you can have a very physically demanding route that might be paved, or you could have a very technically demanding route that is, you know, not all that physically demanding from like a climbing standpoint, but can still be really hard riding. So we try to break those apart. And so if you look at all of these, we rate the physical difficulty as a 6 out of 10 and the technical difficulty as like 4 or 5 out of 10. Whereas like Colorado Trail, Arizona Trail that Kate mentioned earlier, those would be like 8 or so on technical difficulty. If you want to see how we define those you can go to our website and on the interactive routes map page, there's a link to just what a 5 is, what a 6 is, what a 7 is. And as far as how long it takes to ride these loops, these are really challenging estimates to make for folks. Generally, for these loops, we think about something like maybe 40 to 65 miles a day. 65 miles a day on these routes is a big day for a strong rider. 40 miles a day still might take a lot of riders all day. Like don't expect to get out here and be doing 8 or 9 miles an hour on these. They definitely have stretches that are quick and stretches that are much slower. So for the plateau loop, the big one, we think, maybe 9 to 14 days. Like that's a big adventure out there. The Bears Ears Loop is the shortest of them. That's the eastern loop, remember, and the one that actually spends basically traverses the full length of Bears Ears National Monument. And that one is about 370 miles. It's got about 25,000 feet of elevation gain. And for a lot of folks, recommend something like 5 to 9 days out there. There are a few people that have done it in 3 days that I know of, and they were really strong riders and were absolutely worked at the end of it. Like you can do it, but I would not recommend it to pretty much anyone. These are places that it's very enjoyable to linger and take your time. And so, again, that 40 to 65 mile a day range is, I think, a pretty reasonable one. The Swell Loop is a little bit longer. It's 440 miles. That loop has a little bit more faster riding on it compared to the Bears Ears loops. Um, and so 5 to 10 days maybe for that one for a lot of riders. And I think that's it for the numbers part of it. Can go into a little bit more. Oh, that's these maps come out of the guidebook and they're not designed as maps for navigating. All the GPS information, everything is in ride with GPS, and so you can use that for navigating. These maps are kind of for overview, logistical planning, and show where there's water along the way, where there's other features you might want to know about, where the alternates are, that sort of thing. And then can you hop one more ahead, Kate? Okay. Before we dive into details on each of the different segments of those routes, one thing that is really cool about this region is that at least for the Bears Ears Loop, this is an area that sees a lot of tourism, a lot of visitation in the Moab area in general. And so there's some interesting shuttle options out there that the eastern part of the Bears Ears Loop, which is basically riding from Moab down to the Colorado River crossing at height, I think is one of the most stunning rides you can do anywhere in the Western US. I've done it, I don't even know how many times now, and every time I'm just blown away by it. And to just ride that is a point-to-point ride that you need some sort of shuttle to do. And Moab can be the northern end on it, and Height down at the other end, there is basically nothing there at this point. There's a ranger station that I think is closed right now. There's a campground that's closed, and there's a boat launch that is well above Lake Powell waterline at this point. So basically, there's a highway, and that's about it. And it doesn't see much traffic. But there are a few shuttle companies in the area that will potentially help riders get out there. And so if you wanted to drive out there, drop your car and get picked up and get a shuttle back to Moab, grab your bikes, and then ride back to your car, that's an option. So there's Rome Industries, which is a really cool bike shop and little guiding outfit in Monticello. Porcupine Shuttles out of Moab is a really big shuttle company, and they'll do kind of custom shuttles at times if they don't have a lot of other business. Redtail Air is a really fun option. They are mostly a shuttle company for river trips, and they have little planes, and there is actually an airstrip at height. And so that is one of the places they typically will fly. And so you could take a flight from there, no bikes, but you could drop a car and then fly back to Moab with Redtail. And it's actually surprisingly affordable compared to what you might expect. And then Get in the Wild also does kind of custom shuttles at times. So those are some options, and I'll show you on a map just what those shuttle options allow you to do. But there were some people in the questions ahead of time that had asked, like, are there ways to shorten the loop? And in general, you can't really shorten these loops themselves very easily, but doing point to point does open up an option for riding part of the loop, but not all of it.
For context, when I worked river trips for Prescott College, Redtail Air was the most affordable option for a shuttle from Height back to Moab. So, which we weren't using bike shuttle companies. We had just a person to drive a raft vehicle, but um, don't rule it out. It's a pretty incredible experience to fly in a little plane right through the middle of Canyonlands.
Yep, it really is.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to go through these routes segment by segment. And if you look at this overview map here, I'm pointing at it with my cursor, but you can't see my cursor. Segment one is that northern limb of the swell loop from the Western Wildlands route over to the town of Green River. And segment two is from Green River down all the way through Moab, all the way through Height that we were just talking about where the airstrip is, and to the Henry Mountains, right where Kait has the little cursor pointing. 2A is the shortcut back to Green River, and there's an alternate along that you see, the San Rafael Desert alternate that I'll mention. The Segment three is from the Henry Mountains west through Bouldertown to the Western Wildlands route. And then segment four is the part of the loop, the swell loop that runs congruent with the Western Wildlands route on that west side there. So we're going to walk through each of those, just show a few photos from each one, and talk about a few of the details about each of those. Okay, so each of these, there'll be a map that'll orient where you all are, that what we're talking about. The little elevation profile on the lower left there, that's a screenshot out of the guidebook, and so the elevation profiles show just that, the elevation along the route with mileage on the lower axis and elevation on the left side there, and some key locations identified. And then along the bottom of each of those elevation profiles, there's a little strip with different colored bands. And we use those to show in detail what the different riding surfaces are. So pavement is blue, gravel, so like good quality maintained gravel roads are that kind of beige. 4x4 roads are whatever that orangey brown is, and then single track, which there isn't any of on these routes, would be red. So that allows you to look and get a little bit better estimate of like, okay, this next part's going to be faster gravel, and then we got some slower 4x4 roads after that. And then above that is another screenshot from the guidebook that breaks down a little bit more like what percentage of that segment is paved versus dirt road versus 4x4. And then uh, somebody mentioned, I saw in the comments that we need a logistical difficulty rating. We have what we call a bike pack challenge section in these, which kind of gets at that. And the mentions for, I think, every segment of this route pretty much are scarce water and impassable when wet. And we'll talk more about those two key logistical considerations later. And then each of these, we also mention the longest stretch between resupplies and the longest stretch between reliable water sources. And so for this one, it's about 64 miles, which I think is the stretch between Green River and Moab. So hang on, go back one slide, Kait, for 1 second. So this first segment is basically the Western Wildlands route off on the west side, east, down to Green River, and then from Green River to or no, down through Castledale over to Green River. And it's kind of broken into two bits. We'll talk more about what that western stretch is like up high in the plateaus when we talk about the Western Wildlands route. But basically, it's some high elevation riding for a little bit, and then pretty soon a plunge down to Castledale, and then you're across desert of the San Rafael swell. Okay, go ahead, Kait. This is what that desert tends to look like. It's pretty wide open. A lot of that riding is on well-maintained gravel roads out there, so it's pretty fast riding for the most part, and there's not much out there for water. And the whole time, it's a really fun section because you can kind of watch the high country of the Wasatch Plateau disappear behind you, and then often on the skyline there on the left side of the photo, you can see the La Salle Mountains above Moab coming into view, and so you're just kind of gradually making your way toward those as the local landscape around you gradually changes. And you roll right into the recreation epicenter of Moab on bike path, basically from the Moab airport all the way into town. And then once you're there, there's all the services that you could want. Bike rentals you can get in Moab. There's even a couple, I think, people that are kind of doing bike packing rental type stuff and bag rental in Moab at this point. So Moab is a really good place that you could consider starting the entire, like if you're going to do a trip, like go to Moab and then work from there to do all your logistics and everything. Segment two is the one that continues south from Moab down through Bears Ears National Monument and then over to the Colorado River and the Henry Mountains. And this is the part I was suggesting if you're going to ride one section or you want a shorter point to point to do, this is the part to ride, is basically Moab to the Colorado River. And that Colorado River crossing is where the little I mean, it's a former community of Haight, and pretty much everything is closed at Haight at this point. At the that the Park Service had been running, except the airstrip is still operational because it literally is just a paved airstrip with nothing else there. This one is, let's see, 290 miles if you do the full thing all the way to the top of the Henry Mountains there. It's about 23,000 feet of climbing, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're out there, it's a lot of steep climbs that aren't hugely long for the most part. And for this full thing, 5 to 7 days, if you were going to do the Moab to Haight option, that could be more like a 3 to 5 day ride for a lot of folks. And this one is a lot of kind of Jeep road, like not really rough Jeep road, but it's not smooth, well-maintained roads, even though a lot of them in the southern part are actually county roads. They're just not well maintained at all. And then the last part of it has a fair bit of paved riding to get from Haight up to the Henry Mountains. And then the climb into the Henry Mountains is a very long, very steep, very rocky Jeep road. And I think that climb of all of the riding on the Bears Ears Loop, that climb into the Henrys is the most challenging part, both physically and I think technically. For a lot of folks on loaded bikes carrying a lot of water, you'll definitely be hiking some of that climb. But it's literally the only way to get up that side of the mountains, and so it had to be part of the route. The Oh yeah, go ahead, Kate. This is what a lot of that riding in the northern part of the Bears Ears National Monument looks like. You can see in that little shadow in the middle of the photo, there's the Colorado River down there. Or no, that's actually the Green River, I guess.
I
Um,
think because that's on Lockhart Basin Road.
oh yeah, you're right. Okay. And on the other side of there is the White Rim Jeep Road. White Rim is a very well-known uh, bike packing ride or big one-day ride in Canyonlands National Park, and it does a big loop out on that other side of the river. And Lockhart Basin Road, which is what's in the photo here, is kind of like the lesser known, lesser traveled, and even more beautiful Jeep road in the region that traverses the exact same geology. And so that's what the route takes to get down toward the Abajo Mountains from Moab. And then the route climbs up into the Abajo Mountains, which is one of these little, I mean, the true Sky Islands are down in southern Arizona, but these feel kind of like Sky Islands, these very lush islands of mountains in isolated within the desert of the Colorado Plateau, and they're really nice reprieves. Like I've ridden a lot of this in June, where the valleys are quite hot, like it can be 100 degrees or more down low, and then you get up into these mountains, and it's a beautiful like 75, 80-degree day, and there's water and wildlife and everything. And so you just enjoy yourself and move slowly through the mountains and then drop down to the desert and move kind of quickly through the hot stuff down below until you get to the next one of these mountains and climb up into that. So these are the Abajos along the way. And then the route drops out of those. This photo is maybe a little deceptive. Most of the roads are not quite as smooth as this little section looks like. Oh, go back one. And this view is looking up into the Henry Mountains from the east. And so riding toward those. And then the next photo, Kate, is this is the landscape right around the Colorado River crossing at Haight. So you can see the highway bridge right there. The airstrip is just out of the photo right here. And so this basically, if you did that Moab to Haight ride, this is where you would be ending that one, is right in this zone. And if you continue on, you climb from river level there up to, and that's at like 5,000 feet. And this is up by Bull Creek Pass in the top of the Henrys at about 10,000 feet. So it's about 5,000 foot climb, or a little bit less if you're continuing north on the shortcut um, part of the route. So that's the beautiful Bears Ears part. One other thing I want to mention about that is that the monument itself has some incredible Jeep road riding, really remote places that don't see much visitation at all. And we purposefully didn't include any of those in this route. These are following kind of the more main roads, which still don't seem much use at all, but the more main roads through the monument. And there's so much opportunity for exploration on your own off to the sides of this route. That's something we definitely encourage people to do. But because a lot of those areas are particularly sensitive, or we just don't want to be working to send people into areas that previously were very quiet, we didn't want to include those in the official route itself. This next segment, 2A, is the one from, it's the shortcut basically across the middle of the loops. And so that goes from the top of the Henry Mountains north through the town of Hanksville and then back to Green River. And this is well, there's a couple ways to ride this. I think the main 2A is probably the least exciting riding. It's beautiful, but basically you descend out of the Henrys. It's a huge descent to Hanksville, and then you hop on the highway and ride pavement to Green River. And it's a fast way to get there. The views are stunning, but it is a lot of pavement to do that. It's a pretty quiet highway, so safety-wise, that's not really an issue. But the alternative to it is heading out on that alternative into the San Rafael Desert, where the riding can get a little sandier. There's not a lot of water out there. It's really beautiful country, but it's one that we didn't want to make that the main route just because it's the kind of thing that if you're already trying to make a shorter version of the route, that desert option when it's sandy could definitely slow you down and kind of sandbag you, so to speak. And so that's one there are plenty of people that have ridden it and loved it. I've been out there a few times and really enjoy it, but it's one that definitely is more of an alternate for the folks that are feeling a little more adventurous versus maybe staying on the highway. And then there is also the option if you don't want to do that long, long climb into the Henrys. The Henrys are a stunning little mountain range out there, but you can take the paved road from below the Henrys north to Hanksville. That road has very, very little traffic on it, and it's, I think, one of the most scenic roads in the West. So you can't go wrong that way either if you don't want to do the huge climb into the Henrys. Uh, let's see. Kate, you want to move to some photos of this one? So those are the Henrys looking up at them from the desert down below. They're imposing. They're some big peaks out there. This is just north of Henry's, Goblin Valley State Park. This is just a little ways off route, but we have heard from quite a few riders that have gone back and spent a night in the campground there, or just gone for a hike, gotten water at the campground, and then continued on. This is a place I would take my geology students every time I was up there, and they absolutely loved it. It's another remarkable place. And then this is a view out in the San Rafael Desert. And so the Henry Mountains are in the background there. And you see in the foreground, those are legitimate sand dunes. Like there are sand dunes that are blowing around out in that desert. And some of the roads like these are graveled and are in better condition. Some are not. And I mean, I've been out there on a bike with 2.4-inch tires and had to walk a little bit, but not a lot. It does depend a little bit year to year. Like if it's a drought year and there hasn't been moisture in a while, things will be sandier. But it's also beautiful. And you at one point drop down to the San Rafael River and cross the river. It's a beautiful, clear flowing river most of the time right there. And so there is some water out there. And there's a few stock tanks also along the way that are pretty reliable. That's one of the better gravel roads out there too. And then segment three is the short one from shortish from the Henry Mountains down out of the Henrys to the west, and then up to Bouldertown, which is a very small community out there, and then up onto the plateaus to the west where it joins the Western Wildlands route. So this one has a fair bit of climbing on it. The descent out of the Henrys on the west side is a little bit less rocky than the east side, so it's a little bit of a more uh, friendly road, I guess is a good way to put it. And you end up down on the what's the name? The road that goes down to Bullfrog down there, which is a pretty well-traveled dirt road in Capitol Reef National Monument. And then you climb some beautiful switchbacks, which I'll show you a photo of in a minute to the west. And oh yeah, somebody commented Notum Road. That's the one. Thank you, Scott. Notum Road is that beautiful road down in the valley. And up to Bouldertown, and then some climbing up to the west over the Devil's Backbone or Hell's Backbone up to the top of the Boulder Mountain Plateau to the west. Photo wise, that's the view looking. So those are the Henry Mountains. There's the tall peak on the left side there, and then a little pass below it. I think that's where the route goes over, is that notch, which is like 10,000 feet, and then descends gradually down into the foreground here. This ranch with the very lush green grass. That's along Notum Road in that valley there. So this is right near Capitol Reef National Park. And that ranch used to be a place that folks could get water, and then it changed hands and they turned off their irrigation ditch, and there hasn't been water there since, unfortunately. Um, and then the switchbacks that climb away from there, very, very stunning climb. Uh, and then this brings you into Boulder Town. Um, and West Boulder Town is a good place to resupply. There's a couple little stores there, uh, an inn, a world famous restaurant actually out there, Hell's Backbone Grill. And then from there, there's a bunch of climbing to the west to get up onto the high plateaus. And there you're climbing back up to right around 10,000 feet again. And so it's a big climb up into the pines. And in wetter years, there's little lakes all over up there. In drier years, the lakes aren't there, but the pines are still there and it's still green and cool. And that's where you hit the Western Wildlands route. And from there, follow the Western Wildlands route north. And so it's a bunch of high plateau, whether it's in the pines or higher sage country riding, mostly really fast riding up there. Good roads, good dirt roads, gravel roads. And then a big descent down to the town of Salina along the I-70 corridor, where it's another place. All the resupply options you could want are there. There's no bike shop, unfortunately, but everything else, because it's a interstate town, you got lots of services. And then one more big climb back up onto the plateaus. And in this case, it's the southern end of the Wasatch Plateau. And so you're climbing back up again to about 10,000 feet and onto one of the more stunning plateaus in all of Utah, in my opinion. So what's that look like? This is what some of that plateau country looks like. This is the northern end. So that gravel road you can see in the foreground, that descends west or east off the plateau down to Castledale. So that's toward the end of this route. This is a really nice, this section's a really nice gravel road. This is part of Skyline Drive, which runs the length of the Wasatch Plateau. And if you do this southern bit of it on the Bears Ears loops, you only see a small piece of Skyline Drive. But this is one of the quieter bits. Farther north, there's a little more ATV use, and just lots of people camp along it in the summers. This part down here is a little bit quieter. And then there's actually some water out there. This is a really cool little state park campground right outside of Castledale. Nice place to stop and spend the night if you were dropping off the plateau and headed into town. I think that's the last of the photos. Yeah. So that's a quick tour of what to expect out on those loops. I mean, the amount of beauty out there is kind of unbelievable.
Awesome. Um, the final 20 minutes will be dedicated to, maybe 15 minutes will be dedicated to logistics. And so before we move into that, are there any questions about the routes as Kurt has just explained them, the loops, the segments? I don't see any in the Q&A. I do see, how early would the mountains be passable? I'm gonna talk a little bit more about season. The short answer is it depends. But we will dive into that right in this next section. Are there any other questions about segments or the riding? Awesome.
Yeah, let's keep rolling.
Yeah. We will end with questions too. So if any other come up, then we'll take them right at the end. Awesome. Okay, so season, we'll answer our one question. So there are a couple things to say. Like, I think that the Bears Ears loops can be a tricky time to plan to ride because of how diverse the landscape is. A number of sections of these segments could be wonderful in like the shoulder seasons in the earlier spring, late falls, and some of the sections could be really good in the summer. But when you try to put it all together between the heat of the desert and particularly the snow of on the mountains, the season for riding the entirety of any of the loops, because they all do go over higher terrain and low terrain, can be tricky. And so it does depend a lot on the winter. Bikepacking Roots' interactive map does have a snow layer, so you can pay attention to that. Kurt has some tricks for kind of like historical data as well that I'll let him weigh on in a moment. But in general, like the Bajos and the Henrys can be passable generally sometime later in April or in May. And then, of course, through the summer, but starting to think about heat, like June and July and August can be like unbearably hot in this lower terrain.
I
And
would say
then
I would say dangerously hot is
yeah,
a
dangerously.
good word for it.
Like don't recommend riding it. And as you get into a monsoon season, if there is a monsoon happening that year, there are sections of these roads down low that are in like very clay rich soils, like this picture over here. Like when you see that velvety texture, that's really beautiful. Like basically any road and that goes through there that isn't paved would be completely impassable. Like not like just muddy, but like can't turn your tires impassable or really walk comfortably on those roads. So you do want to plan for when the mountains have melted out, but you're not in like a thunderstorm monsoon season. And then fall can also be great. Like, I think the last time I rode that section from Green River down to Height, like over the Abajos, was in October and it was beautiful. It was cold at night in the Abajos, but really lovely riding temperatures. So generally sometime in September through basically until like snow starts to fall, like which tends to happen early November to mid-November, would also be a good time to go out.
Yeah, I think fall is a really beautiful time out there. There's a little bit less surface water usually than there is in the spring months. And so if it is a winter that lets you get out and cross those mountains without too much snow in late April or May, that's probably the time that I would do it if I had that option. Otherwise, fall. Like I said, I've been out here in June. Like it's manageable, but it gets so hot down low, and there were sections that I was carrying 2.5 gallons of water for a day and a half of riding, which isn't all that manageable. And if something goes wrong, you can get into a bad situation pretty quickly. So summer is not an ideal time. Monsoon season, somebody asked here, how long does it take for the roads to dry out after thunderstorms? Depends on how much rain falls and if it clears off. But if there's a big thunderstorm one afternoon, next afternoon probably will be dry by then, aside from some mud around the washes. But it's unlikely that if a storm passes over and you're in that kind of muddy terrain, that you'll be able to move again that day. And so if you are out there in monsoon season carrying enough food and water that you can just stop and camp if a storm hits, wait for stuff to dry out and then keep going is a good idea to plan for.
Yeah, and monsoon season varies these days in when it starts, ends, and the intensity of it. But typically, you should plan like could anticipate it starting towards the end of June, early July, and then lasting through August. Tends
Yeah.
to be over by early September. Um, the there are some awesome questions coming in that we'll address at the end. As far as bike setup, I think these days, like everyone wants to bike pack on their gravel bike if they hear road in it. And we just want to give a fair warning that when selecting roads for this route, or tracks we could call them too, they were with a wider tire in mind. Um, Personally, if I were to go bike pack it this year, I would ride at least a 2.4 tire. I might, depending on what section I was riding, I might choose go up just for kind of comfort and um, better traction on really loose, dry soils, sand, and rocks. That said, we really don't recommend a tire narrower than 2.2. I'm sure that you could get away with two if you are like okay with some sinking and a more abrasive ride on those rougher roads. It should also just be emphasized that like this is the desert. There's a lot more rocks than there is like dirt or loam or soft things. And there are a lot of pokey plants. And so, regardless of what width tire you choose, having a tire compound and sidewall that is reinforced and much more puncture resistant than like lightweight is very recommended. Um, can see goat heads in this picture, like tubeless in general is always a good idea, and it's like very, very, very good idea in the desert because you can like get many punctures a day and it doesn't really matter. You might not even know it.
Yep. I want to include that photo of the goat heads in there. There aren't actually many goat heads out on this. It's basically the San Rafael Desert and the area around Green River are where those are. The rest of it, you're too high for them for the most part, or it's too dry. So it's not a big concern, but there are still a lot of pokey things and a lot of sharp things.
And then beyond tires, when you're thinking about bike setup, like the terrain is not particularly technical while it is rocky, and so you can think about loading your bike for really like you don't have to think too much about loading it for like the technical riding that would come with single track. Like there will be maybe like there will be some hike a bike here and there, but you're not going to be pushing your bike forever and ever. And like, yes, you lift up your front wheel to get up over some like ledges here and there, but like it's not you're not going to need to set up your bike as if you're riding just continuous single track. And because of the scarcity of water and the distance between towns, being able to carry a lot of water and food for the duration that it takes for you between sources or resupply options is a consideration. And so I think our favorite setup these days for this type of route has been like a hardtail mountain bike. I love suspension because it really makes the ride more comfortable with a rear rack to increase that capacity for your gear, water, and food. Um, and then, as a smaller rider, I would probably also like I've bike packed this with that type of setup and then also added like a hip pack or a hydration pack. I don't want a heavy backpack, especially if it's hot, but that is a good way to add a little bit more capacity. And then the last few minutes, we're gonna just talk a little bit about resupply and water. And
Yeah, and
then,
I'm not going to go into much detail in this because this is all in the guidebook. And on the Ride with GPS route information, there's waypoints that correspond with all of these resupply options and water sources. So it's all in here already, tells you about mileage, tells you what it is. Um, there are a few things like the height store on this one in the bottom column that has been closed for a couple years, and so there's an update on our website saying that that is closed. So there's also other resources out there we'll point you toward in a minute where things get updated, because these physical guidebooks are harder to update as regularly since we have to print them. But for resupply options for foods along the way, there are a number of towns that you go through. Each town has a store that you can resupply at, and basically in between those towns there is nothing. And so there won't be any place to get additional food. And some of these areas are also remote enough and seldom visited enough that like if things go wrong, you can't even necessarily rely on running across campers out there or something like that. Like you might not see anybody that day if you run out of food or water. So this is definitely a route to plan carefully and to bring a little bit more than you think you need in case it takes longer than you expect or something goes wrong. Water sources. This is the desert. These are absolutely essential to know about. We put a ton of time into identifying and checking all these water sources, some of them checking them multiple times to get a better idea and talking to people about how reliable they are. And so I'm sure you can't really read that chart on the left, but that's a screenshot of the book. And there's four columns there. One is the location, one is the reliability, and then there's northbound and southbound or clockwise, counterclockwise mileage for those for that segment. And for reliability, this is something like these aren't going to be 100% correct all the time. Like there will be bad droughts where even reliable water sources are completely dry. And there will be years where every single thing has water in it, even if they rarely have water. The water sources that are rarely wet, we don't include in here because they're so unreliable. But we try to include the more reliable ones, the ones that are, potable water where there's a spigot or something like that that you can get water out of, and a lot of stock tanks. And this is one of the interesting intersections of bikepacking and ranching that in places like this, we're very reliant on um, cattle watering, stock watering infrastructure for getting our water. Like that photo on the left is a stock tank fed by a pipe from a well that has been put in by a rancher. And that is one key location out in the San Rafael Desert to get water. So we do rely on those. Um, Yet another reason that we have to respect all the fences and gates and make sure we leave things as we find them so that the ranchers don't get annoyed at us for being out there also. Um, the photo of Kait pleasantly holding a water bottle in front of a very brown earthen stock tank. This is the reality of water in the desert sometimes. It isn't nice, clear water. It is water, and it will get you where you need to go, but you're going to need to treat it. It's water like that. I would not filter. It will destroy your filter before you get even two bottles out of it, probably. So you can treat chemically, or the two photos in the bottom there are using alum powder and a empty milk jug that you fill up with the dirty water and then put a little bit of alum powder and a tablespoon in and let it sit for 20 minutes and it settles out all the silt so then you can pour off the clear water on top. That is a really handy tool to have in your backcountry travel tool belt for places like this if you don't want to drink really brown water. So you can do that and then you can filter it or treat it chemically or whatever you want to do. So guidebook has all of those. The Ride with GPS data sets have all of those on there also. And this is something that you do have to either pay attention to or ask, like, call the Forest Service or BLM out in this area if you're not from around here and be like, hey, how's it been precipitation wise in the last couple months out there? And if they say, ooh, we haven't gotten anything, well, then some of these water sources that are seasonal, listed as seasonal on here, probably won't have anything in them. And so there's definitely some of that kind of just meteorological context that you might have to use to get a better idea for what the water sources are like out there. And then there is one other resource for this route and for the Western Wildlands route that is a um, mobile phone app, and it's through the company Far Out is the name of the app. And one of the reasons that we went with that for this route is because, well, it includes all the GPS data in there, just like in Ride with GPS. But the feature that is really, really valuable in the desert is that any user can leave a comment on any point of interest or waypoint along the way. And for routes like this, the water is the really critical one. So if you have this app and you go ride the route and you go find that, ooh, this stock tank is full of water, and then the next stock tank is completely empty, you can put a comment in there, and next time you have cell service, that comment will update, and everyone else can then see it that, ooh, that one had water, that one didn't have water on whatever the date is. And in the through hiking community, this is really widely used. It's a really, really helpful resource for people traveling in places that water is not 100% reliable all the time. So that app is out there and available. I think it's like $10 maybe to get these routes on it. So pretty affordable. And if you're going to go ride it, I would encourage you to do that and to plug in water information at the POIs so that other people have that as a resource.
All right. Let's take we have some great questions that have come in. One is there are a couple of root questions. One we'll start simply recommended direction to ride each loop.
Wait,
We did.
Kate, can I interrupt for 1 second? Just on these resources that we have for the route, I want to just sum these up before we get lost in questions. Um, but so there's the guidebook for the route. There is the app. There are all the GPS data and everything that you can use for trip planning on your computer or your phone on Ride with GPS. And then on the website, we also have more detailed information about each segment that you can read about. It's not as much as in the guidebook, but it gives you a lot more details. And then there's also for each of the routes on the Bikepacking Roots website, there's a route updates little tab you can click on, and that's where we list any potential changes that, or this water source has gone dry or no longer gets water, this store is closed, that kind of thing. So definitely check those before you go, just in case anything has changed along the way or along time.
Awesome. Um, the Bears Ears loops were designed with riding in a clockwise direction in mind. That is generally making the climbs more climbable. And the descents, just very descending.
I
Or the
would I would
iteration.
argue that they're probably equally difficult or easy in both directions.
You think so?
I think so. Yeah. There's probably room for interpretation or argument around that. But I don't
Yep.
there's no considerable differences, I don't think. Um
Yeah, I think that the if you were to do a shuttle, then the logistics of the shuttle would be one of the considerations.
Mhm.
One question was, are there any recommendations for where to drop a car to start any of the loops?
Hmm. I don't think we included any of that in the guidebook. Moab, it's easy. I've left cars numerous times at there's the big hotel buildings on the north side of town, and I've just called them and asked them if I could leave a car in the back corner of their parking lot, and they've always said yes, that's fine. Green River has Green River State Park right in town, and we've left vehicles there before, and just have to pay the entrance fee and then tell them that, or ask them if you where to park, like where to leave a car overnight, and we've left cars there for multiple nights and been fine. Um, and then
Public trailheads that would have access. They're not just day use, but yeah,
mhm. Yeah,
be able.
and the reality is these routes are like 98% on public lands, and so whether or not you trust where you leave your car, you can park a car just off the road any almost anywhere along these routes, and technically it'll be legal. And it's remote enough that I really wouldn't worry about it.
Um, are there any recommended single track alternates for part all or any of the segments?
Hmm. There is very, very little single track in this region. Um, Moab area has some. None of it fits in well. Like it would add a bunch of miles for mostly, but you could definitely work in as you're entering town and leaving town some sections of single track. The Abajo Mountains have some single track in them, especially if you ride the route counterclockwise, you can get a 5,000 foot single track descent out of the Abajo Mountains. Yep, somebody just mentioned Robertson Pasture. That is one of my favorite trails in the world. In the Abajos, that's what that photo of my former students earlier, that was on the top of that. So that's a really good one. And then there's a little bit over on the west, very far west end of the loops that sees erratic maintenance at best. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it without having had eyes on it recently to know if it's been cleared of deadfall. So not a lot of single track options.
And then similar for alternate ways of traveling, any thoughts on tying in a pack raft float with the ride, which the Colorado River does bisect the loop, and it would be easy to do that. However,
And the green.
and the green. However, what is the park's status on bikes on pack rafts?
Ooh, I don't know what that currently is. Yeah, definitely, because those sections of river are all managed by the National Park Service, um, Canyonlands specifically, I think. And then Lake Powell has their own management for water stuff. Um, and so you'd have to check what the requirements are. There are some options in the far northern end, like south of Green River, on the Green River, but access has unfortunately been restricted in the last year as the BLM has changed their travel management planning, and a few of the places that people were using as access with bikes to put in pack rafts have been closed to bikes, unfortunately, and that isn't going to be reconsidered for a few years at least. So not a lot of options. There definitely are some you'd have to poke around and there's also the San Rafael River, which there is a section downriver of Castledale that is really popular with just like day canoe trips. So there could be something that you could link in on the San Rafael River also, and I think that would be logistically probably the easiest to include.
Mhm. Thoughts on riding the route with a rigid front fork. Yeah, definitely doable. I
Hmm,
think a wider
yeah.
front tire would just make a difference. Um, Fall is a viable option. September through November is a good time. We identified, kind of depends on how much it rains, but generally a day or two for drying for roads. Um, are there any other questions that I've
There's
missed?
yeah, there's one in the comments about is there a preferred bypass around the Abajos if they're snowbound? And the answer is yes. There's another route that we've created that's called a Plateau Passage that uses a bunch of the southern and eastern part of the Bears Ears loops, and it's a Las Vegas to Durango route. It's a very remote, even more remote and deserty than this one. Um, but that one has a bypass, and if you go to the interactive routes map on the Bikepacking Roots website, you can see what that bypass is. Um, to get, you basically have to go down to Monticello and then climb back up to the route. But there is an option for how to avoid the high Abajos if there's snow there.
And so we're just going to close with a very short reading from a section of the guidebook that Renee Hutchins, a Dene woman, wrote for the guide, for the Bears Ears Loops guide. When we are biking on the land, we should ask ourselves, whose land are we on? You are never alone when you are outside. Instead, you are held by the land and held by my ancestors. Take a long pause while you look out onto the landscape. Hear the birds or smell the sage and remember that the land and everything living on it are our relatives, our family, and we need to take care of them. Remember, there were people here long ago, ancestors of people today that share the same spirit, and just like them, also have a sacred connection to this land. The land connects us all together with one another and my key. I encourage you all to connect with the land and to develop a relationship with the land with this context in mind so you can see and feel the heart of the people and understand what it is we're trying to protect and defend. And with that, we've already taken questions, and we really appreciate Ride with GPS for sponsoring this series to make these free for folks to learn and get inspired about the routes out there. Bikepacking Routes is work, and the routes created, like the Bears Ears Loops and the resources that go along with them, are made possible by members and support by people like you all. And so if you're grateful for any of the resources that you find in your hands, like a webinar or a guidebook or a GPX file, please consider a donation to Bikepacking Routes. Thank you all for coming. And there will be an announcement with the next Waypoints webinar on another route coming soon.